Wayland, the head writer and editor of the Singular Fortean Society.
And I'm Emily Wayland, the designer and photographer for the Singular Fortean Society. And today we have with us Corey from Phantasmagoria Photo. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
This is another installment of Fortean Photography, and today we are going back to England again to talk about the Tulip Staircase Ghost.
So you guys have both had an opportunity to examine the photograph, but before we dive into that, why don't you give us a little background?
Sure. So basically this house, I'm going to look at notes because I have a lot of information here. The staircase is built in this queen's house, which was built in 1616 for Queen Anne of Denmark, who was wife of King James I. For the longest time, it has been the National Maritime Museum. So basically the story goes, a retired British Columbian minister named Reverend Ralph W. Hardy and his wife had seen this a photo of this tulip staircase from the Queen's house in a magazine. And it's a helicular staircase, so for its time it was quite the architectural...
Can you tell people what that means exactly? Like what kind of staircase are you describing and what made it special?
It's a spiral staircase that's supported by itself. It's not supported by any other...
Interesting. So yeah, something of an architectural, easy for me to say, architectural marvel of its time.
Yes,
okay.
And it's definitely like the fixture, the center of the Queen's house. So yeah, though his wife had seen this in a magazine and they're like, hey, we should go to England and check this out. I want to take a picture of this. So they went, it was January 1st, 1966, and they went to the museum. And just for some context, this museum has a lot of old, expensive art in it. And so they went up to the staircase, they were going to try to take the picture, but the bottom was roped off. And to be able to get this picture that they wanted of the beautiful skylight in the entirety of the staircase, they would have to get onto the stairway, which wouldn't be able to happen since it was roped off this
That
day.
was disallowed.
It was not allowed.
Okay.
So the Reverend was like, well, it's pretty. She wants a picture of the staircase. I'll take a picture of it kind of from underneath, because it does look neat from underneath. So he took this picture, and at the time he didn't notice anything. But after he developed the picture, he couldn't help but notice a robed figure going up the staircase, because the hands are gripping the railing and all you see is like a ghostly white robe.
Sure, it looks like somebody hunched over almost, pulling themselves up along.
Up the staircase.
Yeah. Okay.
So of course this mystified the Reverend and his wife, and they had to of course figure out what was going on here. They kind of got themselves in contact with the museum's senior photographer, Brian Tremaine, and wanted to send them the information about the photograph. They contacted one of the oldest paranormal societies, the Ghost Club, which was founded in the 1800s, and they also sent the film off to Kodak to be analyzed.
Okay, well, what were the results of the investigation and the analysis?
So it's a over 400-year-old building, so there definitely was some there are stories about like disembodied voices coming from the staircase, smells of wet stone, footsteps, all that stuff you typically hear with any ghost phenomena.
I don't know that I hear smells of wet stone necessarily in every haunting, but fair enough.
Okay. Anyways, they smelled wet stone, they heard disembodied voices, footsteps, babies crying.
That's
another
one. Yeah.
And this was recorded. The Ghost Club came there with the couple in July that year. They had a sound engineer that recorded this. We don't have access to these records, but from what we understand, the phenomena they heard matched up with some other, folklore that we had heard about the place.
Okay, so the Ghost Club, in their investigation, spoke to people who were able to corroborate the sort of folk tales that were known popularly about this particular site.
And there was an urban legend about a maid who had apparently, like probably when the queen was still living there, of a maid that got thrown 300 feet down to her death. So
okay,
that's kind of like one of the urban legends
sure.
about the staircase.
Well, when it comes to things that are centuries old like that, it can be
Yeah.
difficult to confirm those types of reports.
Exactly.
Sure.
So, and they did a really thorough investigation. They even covered like the staircase railing in Vaseline to make sure there were no fingerprints, and they made sure everybody's watches were synced up so they knew the times everything was happening. So it was a very thorough investigation, and that's what it came out of it. Kodak investigated the film, and the film was not tampered with. It is not a hoax, and it also was not a double exposure.
Really, just to break it down for all the viewers at home, what you're saying is there was no evidence that Kodak could find at the time to show that the film itself had been tampered with in any way.
Correct.
So were were this to be hoaxed, it would have to have been a physical object present at the time.
Person or object, like it had to have happened. And of course, the Reverend to his deathbed said, you know, this happened. We didn't see anybody. We didn't hoax it. But also think about it. It's a museum with a lot of expensive paintings. There's guards and security. Sure. There's a good chance that they would make sure nobody was climbing up that staircase.
Well, and that's a good point. And I think we also have to consider the fact that, as far as we know, the Reverend and his wife didn't profit from this photograph in any way.
Right.
So you have to question what the motivation would have been behind a hoax, were it one. Also, as far as we know, that there was no previous connection between the Reverend and his wife and the museum.
Correct.
So the possibility of the museum sort of putting him up to it to increase, their attendance seems unlikely.
From what I've gathered and researched, the Reverend and his wife are just like some people that reach out to us about things. They just had something happen and they want to find the truth behind it.
Witnesses to the impossible.
And
exactly.
how often would places like that back in the 60s be more open to like doing like paranormal type stuff? I don't know if a lot of places would be like they would be today, where the paranormal would be sort of an attraction. I don't think back in the 1960s that was really much of a thing.
Well,
at that point.
That's a great point. So sure.
Especially a government-funded museum.
Right.
You can only imagine too, like our Wisconsin State Capitol, the staff are not allowed to say that they have paranormal experiences. They just, as an establishment, do not talk about that or associate with it. So
sure, that makes a lot of sense.
That's a good point that Corey brought up.
Okay, awesome. So now that you've established a little bit of background, now you guys are both photography experts. You're both photographers by trade. You do
Corey's
it professionally.
got he has a lot more film experience than I do, so he can help us kind of talk about that aspect of it.
Great. Well, I'll throw it over to you guys then. Why don't you let us all know a little bit about what you thought of it?
Okay.
Do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I mean, first off, looking at the photograph, actually, especially seeing the color version is a lot more, offers a lot more information than I would say the black and white.
And just for context, the black and white one is the one you usually see rotated around the internet. The original print did have a crease in it, as we're displaying here, so it's been edited, photocopied, copied again, and that's kind of how we ended up with this black and white version versus the actual print itself. And
I saw the color version today, actually for the first time, and I was quite impressed by how much detail was involved with it. In the old black and white, all you see is like above the figure, just a white blob where these candelabras were. The light shining on the wall is just a big white blob, but in the color version, you can actually see much more detail in the candles themselves, and it gives a lot more perspective on how it's photographed and everything. And from just looking at it, it is, I mean, to be honest, it's a pretty crappy exposure of a photo. I was wondering about, what was he trying to accomplish in photographing this? Was it a mistake? Was it something he actually pushed he was setting up his camera, hit the shutter, and it went off, and he captured this? Stuff like that's happened before. And because I thought if it was something that he was purposely setting up and trying to compose and trying to set up an proper exposure, it would have been a lot better than what is the end result with it. And him using daylight film and using a daylight filter would kind of give, and plus, so he's using that film in a camera inside. You're gonna get a lot of a yellowish hue to everything, especially when the light back then was tungsten, and so that gives off a yellowish light. And so looking at the color photograph, it's a very yellowish and very gaudy looking type of a photograph.
I'm gonna back up for a second. This is one of the rare cases where we know exactly what camera and film was used. So Mr. Hardy used a Zeiss Icon Contina camera with a Zavart Anastigmat. I knew I would butcher that, but I didn't.
Close enough.
Fitted with a skylight haze filter. They used Kodachrome XK2 Daylight 35mm film with a speed of 64. They did not know for certain the length of exposure for the picture. However, Reverend Hardy had to rest the camera held by hand against a door jamb to prevent blurring since it was darker inside the house. 64 speed film is not light sensitive and is meant for brighter daylight situations and not necessarily interior, although the skylight would provide light.
A little bit, but it wouldn't be very much. This, because it's shooting straight up, and of course, the sun is not directly going through the skylight, so it's pretty much just going to be blue sky. Mm-hmm. So that's not really going to offer a whole lot of light.
So basically, he had the exact wrong film.
Yeah, he had the wrong. Yeah, he was shooting the wrong film interior without a tripod. At 64 ISO or ASA back in the day is very, very slow, and trying to shoot that handheld, I'm surprised that it is. I know he was leaned up against a door jamb and trying to hold it steady. I mean, you can do it, but I'm amazed that it is as sharp as it is for such a slow film for that time.
Well, that's an interesting point. So overall, it sounds like what you're describing is a pretty amateurish effort.
Oh,
yeah,
absolutely.
As far as photography,
that would have been something.
We were talking before, and Corey was even bringing up the point, like, he was probably just taking pictures outside and didn't think anything of it, and brought his outside daylight film and daylight filter into a very dark place with artificial lighting.
Yeah.
Now, something else that had piqued my interest is that you had mentioned specifically the slow shutter speed of the camera he was using. Now, if you look at the figure in this photograph, it does appear to be elongated a little bit, in its right arm at least. Now, could that be the result of that slow shutter speed?
Possibly, yeah.
So if there was somebody,
because you look in the hand is much further. You could reach out, hold there for a few seconds, and it would record it, and then you would move, and then you stay at another position a lot longer. It would record that, but between that, you would not get. It wouldn't. The film wouldn't see it. It would just be. It wouldn't record very well, and so. I mean, it's very possible that you could use a really long shutter exposure, and it could have done that.
Okay, so it could, if were there someone present, regardless of the museum security, regardless of the testimony of the Reverend and his wife, we have to admit that it is a possibility that were someone present, a long exposure from the slow shutter speed could be responsible for the unusual elongated effect on the reputed ghost in the photograph.
Right.
Yes, and that matches Kodak's testimony as well. Like Kodak said, if something would have had to have been present for this phenomena to occur,
Right.
Sure.
if it were a hoax. So
Right.
Okay.
that's
With
important
his
to
wife, could have been
mention.
his wife. Having the long exposure and having his wife there, I couldn't quite rule out saying that it could be a hoax because it's possible. I could probably recreate this, but to say that it, you know, if I being able to recreate it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what happened.
Right.
So, but yeah, I mean, there is that possibility that it could have been.
Well, and that really comes down to so many of the cases we investigate, honestly, is where, you know, it really comes down to the credibility of the witness and frankly whether or not you believe them. If you believe the Reverend and his wife, then they captured a ghost.
I choose to believe them just based on the fact that how they went about, you know, trying to answer their questions and solve the picture versus like they didn't try to hide. I mean, it wasn't published in anything until much later. They really just wanted to figure out what the heck it was.
Right. One would have to wonder if it was hoaxed, what would their motivation be? Doesn't seem like they profited in any way.
Right.
So who knows?
And that's a lot of cases with a lot of this sort of stuff with the paranormal, especially when it comes to like ghost photography, is that it's never straightforward. It's always, you know, it's always kind of like vague. So,
Sure. There are a myriad of possibilities.
it's never laid out specifically. There's always a sense of that mystery or wonder to it. So.
Yeah, fair enough. So Emily, do you have anything to add from your own analysis to what Corey's been saying?
I think Corey's knowledge of film was definitely an insight to this. I've shot film, but I never like it. When I was in college, it was definitely more, I learned the dark room, but I never like worked with film, like
Okay, not
professionally.
Yeah.
So I think that's why I asked him to come and analyze this with me. I definitely think that based, you know, like I feel like I'm being a dead horse here, but based on what we've talked about, I think the Reverend and his wife are being credible. It's definitely like I love this case because it has so much information over other cases, like down to what camera and film they used. And also just like the history of the place having the story, what they heard at the investigation was what matched the folklore of the place too.
Sure.
So
Right.
that, I mean, granted, those are pretty, I hate to say cliche, common phenomena associated with some hauntings, but
The photograph actually matches sort of the experiences that people
exactly.
have with it.
Well, and consider this too. So, from your own analyses, the photograph itself was a very amateur effort. And so, you would think if someone had enough knowledge of the operation of film cameras to know that a long exposure could create this kind of effect, wouldn't they also be aware of what type of film they would use in that environment to get a better picture? Or I guess the other side of that would be, could the knowledge shown there actually have informed them enough to where they took a deliberately bad picture to help hide anything that might give it away?
That's possible.
It's possible, but I mean, the coloring and the biggest thing that makes me doubt that they were doing that is the coloring.
Okay.
Because they did not, I mean, I think the yellow makes it look less spooky than it would otherwise. Like the yellow tungsten gives off yellow light. Our eye is correct for that, and so you need to apply filters or different white balances in settings in your digital cameras to correct that. And they had the exact opposite film for that situation.
Right.
So that, I think, in itself kind of shows like they weren't considering even that.
Yeah. In slide film, in general is not a very forgiving film compared to negative film. Negative film, you could be a stop or two off and still get a great photo out of it. Slide film, you can't be more than a half a stop, and then things start really going bad.
So when you say half a stop, for somebody like me who knows nothing about film cameras, what does that mean?
Your camera, or your apertures are divided into stops, f-stops.
Okay.
The f is just arbitrary. So you have like 1.8, f2, f2.8, you know, f4, f5.6, you know, and so on and so forth down the line. The bigger the number, the smaller the aperture.
Okay, and the aperture is what is behind the lens that lets light in.
Right, it's basically your iris for the camera.
If you were
it
thinking
allows,
of like an eyeball.
Right, and it allows only so much light in, and where the shutter speed determines how long that is exposed for. The film speed determines how
Sensitive.
all that is, how that related to how much, how sensitive, how it's related to how much those settings change. If you have a low ISO or ASA back in the day, low shutter speed, or film speed, you're gonna have to have long exposures. Where if you have like a film speed of like 1,000 or something like that, your exposure is gonna be really short because you have very sensitive film. Like your eye would be very sensitive to light, and so that's basically what that is.
That would freeze motion.
Yes.
Because it would be moving so quickly, it would be snapping down. Whereas
Yes.
if something's moving in front of the camera, that's how you get that motion blur. It's kind of you've probably seen star trail pictures where it's like the stars create streaks through the sky. It's because the Earth is revolving and the camera's shutter in those cases is left open for like an hour. Given the fact they use 64 speed film and this figure is kind of blurry, if it was a long exposure, that would match that case.
He could have totally used this film if he would have did it in a different way. If he would have put his camera on a tripod, used a cable release so it wouldn't have any motion, and then use a different filter on his camera to compensate for the yellowish cast. So you'd have to use like some sort of like a bluish hue to sort of compensate for that. And then you would have to have really long exposures, and a tripod would really be the only way to.
You need something to stabilize it.
Yeah, stabilize it.
So it sounds to me like what you're saying is, if this were a hoaxed photograph where they used a long exposure to create the elongated effect on the spectral figure, given that the photo was supposedly taken by leaning up against a door jamb, that really wouldn't stabilize it enough, and you would expect other things in the photograph to be blurry. Is that right?
Yeah, you would. Yeah, I mean, you could. From what the photograph. I mean, it's possible. I mean, depends on how stable, how much you're up against it, and and you're up and you're holding it and you hold your breath and shoot it. Yeah, I mean, it's totally possible, but
it's not.
It's not. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Well, I think that's I think that's a fascinating insight, honestly. So that sort of allows for the possibility of a hoax, but given the increased difficulty, makes it seem less likely.
And one thing I do like about this is that there's a lot of documentation about the sort of the background of the photograph.
Right.
And there's a lot of insight into what he was shooting, how he shot it, the camera, the film,
He was willing to give all those answers out.
And a lot of it's tough when you have a ghost photo and there's not. It looks really good, but you have to question it a lot because there's not a lot of extra background information on it, and it sort of, because it's hard to really make a good judgment on a photo if there's really nothing.
Sure.
Because you're not there, so you got to figure out what the situation was at that moment.
Right.
So.
The more information you have about the equipment and technique and situation, the better able you are to evaluate the circumstances.
Give it a genuine, honest evaluation, yeah.
Sure, okay,
And
yeah,
to
good
this
point.
day, the photograph hasn't been able to be debunked. People have this information, and I'm sure people could go and try to replicate it and see what they could produce. But yeah, it's 2019 now, and as far as we know, this photograph's authentic.
Sure, okay, yeah, interesting. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do you guys think? Final thoughts?
I think it's genuine.
Okay.
I
Same.
think it's genuine.
Wow, fascinating. All right, well, thanks, guys. And thanks for putting up with me asking a lot of ignorant questions about photography.
Well, you're the investigator. So.
And I always thought it was, at first when looking at it, I always thought it was a hoax. And then as I learned more about it, I realized, no, this is probably legit. So
Okay.
something I was impressed by.
Awesome. Well, thanks again to Corey from Phantasmagoria Photography for being with us here today. Of course, thank you to my lovely wife, Emily, as always. And thanks to all of you for watching from me.
Where can people find you, Corey?
Phantasmagoriaphoto.com. I have on Facebook, Instagram, Phantas Photo. Through that, I'm on. Well, I have a Twitter account, but I don't really use it too much.
Twitter is hard.
Yeah,
Sure.
It's not my thing really, but.
Fair enough.
You know.
Well, so you can find him on Twitter, but
Yeah.
not like find him.
You
Find
might
him.
not be able to reach him there.
Sure.
Well, yeah, I'm not really on it too much.
And
Well,
we'll link
let's concentrate on what you are on. Okay.
We'll link his information in the description below, and you can always find us at singularfortean.com or any of our various social media outlets. And also, we're on Patreon.
Yeah, if you like what we do, if you agree with what we do, and you want to be a part of it, we welcome anyone and everyone to join us at the Singular Fortean Society, and you can do that by signing up through Patreon. We offer a variety of benefits dependent on the level at which you'd like to join. Full members are privy to all of the normal content, plus our extra videos and a monthly live stream where we like to get together with other society members and talk about important paranormal issues of the day. So look for us there.
Right, so thanks for watching, and thank you, Corey, for
Thank you
joining
for
us.
having me. I enjoyed it.
Probably have you back for future episodes.
That's fine.
Always
We have
appreciate
to,
your
of course.
insight. So, yeah, thanks for watching, and if you like what you see here and you're not subscribed already, hit that subscribe button. You can hit the little bell to see whenever we upload exactly, and then also feel free to give it a thumbs up and comment on your thoughts below what you think of this photograph. So, until next time, thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Keep it weird.
All right.
That
It's
was
fun
good.
doing that stuff with like